Welcome to the Social Exchange Podcast, episode 55. Today's guest is six-time New York Times best-selling author. He's a professor at Chapman University, host of the Science Salon podcast, and founding publisher of Skeptic Magazine, Dr. Michael Shermer. Michael Shermer and I discussed his new book, Giving the Devil His Due, Reflections of a Scientific Humanist. This book centers around free speech, and why it's not just a right among many, but the foundation of all other rights and privileges, and how exercising free speech, not only your own free speech, but the right for others to speak, is one of, if not the best tool for honest, truth-seeking people. Obviously, this captures the essence of the social exchange and our existence. So here's a non-exhaustive list of some of the topics we touched today. We talked about free speech, why it's the most precious right, why it must be upheld always. We discussed Rappaport's rules for engagement and why it behooves us to follow them. If you're not familiar with Rappaport's rules, but you're a part of the Social Exchange Facebook group, our rules closely resemble Rappaport's rules. I asked what he believes is the appropriate relationship between religion and science. And I asked Michael to talk about a section of the book in which he reflects on some of his own devils of the past, people he's debated, including Jordan Peterson, the psychologist and author of 12 Rules for Life, David Irving, a Holocaust denier and journalist that Shermer debated a long time ago, and Graham Hancock, a writer and journalist, a self-proclaimed alternative archaeologist whom Michael debated on the Joe Rogan podcast. And we briefly talked about my 2017 debate on my show with Peter Hitchens, and how that conversation, despite being a completely painful one, changed my way of thinking about conversations in general. One last thing, I apologize that Michael's audio is spotty in a lot of sections. We spoke over Zoom, and he cut in and out somewhat frequently. So you can understand everything he says, but some parts are clearer than others. I think, or at least I hope, it'll be tolerable on your end. But as always, write me nasty messages if it's not. Now I hope you'll all enjoy episode number 55 with Dr. Michael Shermer. I'm here with Dr. Michael Shermer. Dr. Shermer is the founding publisher of Skeptic Magazine, the host of the Science Salon podcast, a presidential fellow at Chapman University, where he also teaches the course Skepticism 101. He's the author of several New York Times best-selling books. He wrote a monthly column for Scientific American for 18 years until recently. His new book, which we'll discuss today, is called Giving the Devil His Due, Reflections of a Scientific Humanist. Michael, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, nice to be on here. Thanks for having me.
Do you find that over time your CV just compounds so much that it becomes exhausting to list your bona fides in an interview?
I'm 65 now, so it does accumulate over the decades. I've been writing really since my 20s. In college, I started writing that. Really, for me, if I don't do it, it feels uncomfortable, like I'm anxious. Much like working out. I mean, I ride my bike every day, and if I don't do that, I feel like I got to get out there and do something. And sort of that with writing. If a couple hours a day, I try to put in some research or writing project.
And you just stopped writing for Scientific American, is that right? As I'm reading it, that's Scientific American.
Yeah, that was
tense.
last year. Yeah, that was last year. I would have been happy to keep going, but they had a change of editors, and they got rid of almost all columnists. I'd been there the longest, except maybe for Martin Gardner before me. It's okay. I mean, all organizations change. I miss it. I like having that monthly goal and trying to come up with something new every month. But I still write for Skeptic, of course, and lots of other publications, and do podcasts now, which is weekly. So that pretty much keeps me on my toes, particularly since I actually read the books of my guests. So that also takes time. So I do a lot of audio since I can cycling, hiking, driving around town, whatever. I can just consume content by audio. There's just so much high quality content available now. Audio books and the teaching company and all the free course universities have, and it's just endless. It's amazing.
Well, we're speaking in the midst of a global pandemic, so hope you're well. Has this had any effect on besides the obvious, on your life and your workflow?
Well, of course, the university closed Chapman, so I've been doing
Right.
remote lectures at a studio here in Santa Barbara where I live, and that's interesting to try to navigate the technology and get slides and videos in there and all that stuff. But my course is 17 students, and it's supposed to be a seminar where we discuss things, and that's been difficult. And students are scattered all over the country, and some of them having challenges with getting the internet, the Zoom, and all that stuff. So I just kind of went straight for a lecture just to finish up the semester. And yeah, I don't know how long this is going to last. I think this could really change education. Well, it's going to change everything, really. But I think it's going to be clear that you don't have to be in a brick and mortar building to get educated, at least from
Right.
lecture material. Again, the interaction with professors, by students in a small classroom, that you can't really replace it with even a high quality thing like now Zoom, even without the flaws that it sometimes has apparently, and the Zoom bombers crash in on different meetings and all that. It's quite the same as being in person and interacting with people in the room. But that's small university life. Of course, the social life can't be replaced by the internet, but just the pure knowledge content that you're transferring from one brain to another, that can be done any number of ways.
Yeah, yeah. I teach at a high school, and I've noticed that there's this thing that's happening with parents that are saying, "What is my kid doing in school all day?" And they're supposed to be getting the same kind of content, but this seems to be taking them an hour or 2 hours during the day. So what are my kids doing when they're in school?
Right.
If there's benefit, is it the social benefit? Are they just babysitters?
Yeah, yeah.
But an interesting learning curve. Anyway, great to talk to you again. And, my podcast, my blogs, social media groups, they're all grounded in first principles that include something like Rappaport's rules for dialectic, as well as the value of liberty and free speech per John Stuart Mill, Thomas Paine. So it's fitting, given the essence of this show, that we're discussing a book called Giving the Devil His Due. Help me set the foundation. Who is the devil? What does he do? Who owes him something?
Yeah, you nailed it with John Stuart Mill and Thomas Paine and so on. I mean, these are the great champions of free speech, and historically, it's always been liberals that are champions of free speech, and more of the conservative end of the spectrum that want to control speech and thought. By the way, all the way up until maybe 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, when it started to shift, where conservatives are now defending freedom of speech, and it's liberals that are censorship in the name of squelching hate speech. I shouldn't say liberals, real liberals, classical liberals, liberals, traditional John Stuart Mill, are still in favor of pure free speech. But just let's say far leftists, they're the ones that are kind of turn the thing upside down. And so the devil is whoever you disagree with or disagrees with you, whoever holds positions that you don't hold. That's who the First Amendment is for. That's who has to be given their due. And if for another reason, for your own safety's sake, and the argument I make is really that when you set up customs, norms, and especially laws that make it acceptable to censor people in the name of some good cause, everybody has a reason that they want to do it. Regardless of the reason, once it's set up, what happens when you're in the minority position? What happens when you're holding positions that authorities don't like or feel is threatening? So I tracked this back in the United States to 1919 and the Supreme Court case Schenck v. the United States, in which the Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, writing the majority position, that the shouting of fire in a theater presents a clear and present danger to the nation that Congress has the right to censor. Okay, well, what is this clear and present danger? That's the equivalent of shouting fire in a theater. In 1919, it was this guy named Schenck, Charles Schenck, who was the head of the Socialist Party in Philadelphia, who was distributing anti-draft literature to draft-age young men who were being sent off to war when the United States got involved in war. At the time, it was really just a European war. And, what business is it of ours to go over there and meddle around in other people's affairs? And Schenck's argument in this really well-written leaflet was that the 14th Amendment, 14th Amendment guaranteed bodily autonomy and the prohibition of slavery. And look, now own your body for the next 4 years. You belong to us, and we're sending you off to war, and you could die. Too bad. He argued that was constitutional. Okay, now to modern ears, that's pretty wacky. Like, yes, but draft protesters, that was big in the 60s. What's wrong with that? And the answer is nothing's wrong with it. But back then, that was what the Supreme Court decided was a clear and present danger. Protesting the draft is a present danger, the equivalent of shouting fire in a theater. That's crazy. But with mission creep and the expansion of that category of what constitutes what we would today call hate speech or dangerous speech, you can see how you could justify silencing almost anyone for almost anything in the name of national security, secrets, just the whole surveillance state. That's what's behind that, is like, we got to, people are saying, because this could be a threat to our nation. Any political leader, and this is of course what autocrats do all the time, is they're always saying, that in the interests of national security and the nation's security and so on, these people over here are therefore to shut them up. Okay, that's always a dangerous precedent to go down, and so that's the core of the book.
So in a free society, free speech needs to be given primacy, not most speech, not some people's speech, no exceptions, all speech, and just protected and treated as the most precious of rights, and really no exceptions in your mind, not for hate speech, not for yelling fire in a crowded theater. Everyone has the right to speak. Do I have the right beam on that?
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. Now, of course, there's obvious exception. I can't give the nuclear codes to the Soviet Union or the Chinese. There are certain things like which made the Edward Snowden case a little gray in some areas. Some of the information that he leaked to the media that then got published apparently did like name names of people that were foreign agents, other countries of ours, foreign agents of ours. A case could be made for some of that, but for the most part, what he exposed in the WikiLeaks, as did Daniel Ellsberg with the Pentagon Papers, was to what extent government was covering things up, lying to its citizens, doing things without congressional approval or even knowledge. The meddling of other people's democratic elections in the 1970s in South American countries, in particular elsewhere, that was a place that it's now become known. And, we're up and at the Russians meddling in our democracy. We do this all the time. We prop up dictators that are more fascist and right-wing than communist and left-wing, because we determine they're more favorable to main interests, primarily military and business. And therefore, we go on down there and we fund some groups and we fund other groups in hopes that that one guy will win over the other guy. He's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. It's like we would have known about that had the whistleblowers not come forward. And that's the kind of thing we need in a free society is a free press and transparency of our political, however they're chosen. And that, so that's all part of that kind of fundamentalist perspective on free speech. It's just it's the foundation of all other rights.
In the book, you brought up Christopher Hitchens giving the speech in a packed auditorium where he starts by yelling fire, and then he's just marveling along with the crowd that nothing's happening. So I'm going to guess that most of my listeners who read your book or who will read your book, they'll grant this example. Does this apply to other actions across the board? Like, not even so extreme as nuclear codes, but what about calling a bomb threat into a crowded theater or writing death threats to the principal of the school? Are these analogous?
These are rare instances that, the government feel need to use as an example to ramp up its powers. Like the fact that all of us, hundreds of millions of people a year, have to take their shoes off at the airport because this one guy wants, the shoe bomber. That's the kind of overreach. The chances of being killed in a terrorist attack in the United States is close to zero. It's in the low single digits per year on average if you start after 9/11. But car accidents, or heart disease or obesity, I mean, these are kinds of things that we should be far more worried about, but we're not. And the government does, very little comparatively compared to how it responded in 9/11, which is Homeland Security Agency, which is now the second largest agency in the history of the United States government. It's a vast surveillance state. Not as bad as Chinese or East Germany, but it's huge. And even though it was started under Bush, Obama expanded it. And again, if it wasn't for Snowden, we wouldn't know that, Mr. President Transparency was going to tell us about everything. Well, he didn't. And, he was, Snowden, he wasn't able to come home during Obama's administration. So he's still stuck in Russia. So that's the kind of thing. And now I'm a little bit worried about this contact tracing that the government's proposing we do. Now, initially it sounds good. It's just Google and Apple combining to create this app, and that you have COVID-19, you log in voluntarily, and then everybody that comes into contact with you is notified, through their cell phones, know where they are. Google knows where they are. And Apple and so on. So, and that sounds good on the surface. Like, we got to know about this. But hang on. First of all, once this thing peaks and continues along for the several months or years, pretty everybody is either going to have had COVID-19 or will know somebody has had it or have potentially been in contact. So pretty much every single person in the United States will be on the government radar list of people we have to walk out to see what they're doing and where they're going. Okay, all right. So let's say we decide as a nation that that's a good thing. Okay, how about in a couple of years when the pandemic is gone and the virus, we just get a vaccine and it's just like the flu virus now and no big deal. Does the government give us back the freedom and quits doing that? Probably not, because they never do that.
Historically speaking, right. No, that's not going to happen, right? Yeah.
They never give up power. So, and it's always in the name of something that seems reasonable at the time. Like, we can't have those draft protesters because that could lead to this, and this before you know it. So, calling in bomb threats, not good. But that's already a crime in which, people caught or convicted. Something different than like passing some law censoring people from thinking about it or saying they might do it or whatever. What we're concerned about is what people actually do.
Right. So we've talked about, this is now the societal implications of liberty and free speech. If something's going to be truly free by definition, we can't assign a gatekeeper. So we need to ensure that right is universal. Most of your book delves into personal encounters you've had. It was really cool. I really am enjoying reading it. You're using those personal connections as an inroad to say, look, law or no law, let's leave that aside. It behooves you as an individual to apply the free speech principle, even if you don't have to. That idea that every time you silence somebody, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot because you're stymieing your own right to hear them speak.
Right. It's not, when students silence a speaker, deplatform a speaker, or silence them by the heckler's veto, shouting and making noisemakers and so on. It's not just the right of the speaker to speak, it's the right of the audience to listen. People that come to hear a speaker, they're there for a reason. They hear what he has to say. And the protesters are the ones that are in violation there. But let's go through some of Mill's arguments, because I think they're pretty solid and straightforward, that, even if you're completely right, if you know your own side of the argument, you don't even realize that. So my favorite example with this is, most of my students are pretty liberal and most of them are pro-choice. And when I ask them, what the best arguments on the other side, like the pro-lifers, what do they argue? Oh, well, they hate women. No, that's not an argument. Make that argument. That is the argument they're making. If you counter it with that, you've set a straw man, you've got a still man at, so here, watch a Ben Shapiro video about pro-life. And it's like, oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Those are pretty good arguments. Okay. What's your counter to those good arguments? And so just, even if you're right, okay, now who knows who's really right, but even if you assume you're right, just listening to the other side improves your own arguments. Like when I refuted the Holocaust deniers and creationists and so on, I've really improved my arguments for why we think it was true, climate change is real, the Holocaust happened in this way and not another way. I've improved my arguments even without giving an inch on those positions. But more importantly, on other positions that are not so obviously right and wrong, which is most right, that you're partially right and you're partially wrong. And the only way to find out is talking to people who don't agree with you. And then you can, tune your own arguments and change your mind here or there. And you might be completely wrong. And then, you've gone off the rails with some crazy idea. This whole lot of peer review in science and going to conferences and having colleagues and talk to them about your ideas. If you work in isolation, you're very likely to go down some crazy path that leads to nowhere. And I get these letters all the time, pretty much every week, of somebody that has some new theory of everything, where they figured out the universe and Newton was wrong and Einstein was wrong and Stephen Hawking was wrong, and I get it out. And I've been working in my basement. This is all I do. I'll try with you if you help me get it published.
Right.
And, did you bounce this off like the local high school physics teacher, because I'm not a physicist, I'm a social scientist. What do I know? It sounds like there might be something wrong here at 3. And, of course they haven't done that. Oh, the science can't accept this because they're too magic and closed-minded. They live in flatland, and this is a sphere land, baseline, multidimensional, whatever theory that other people can't understand. You got to have an open mind. It's like, yeah, everybody says that. Galileo was laughed at, and they laughed at the Wright brothers. Well, they laughed at the Marx brothers. Being laughed at doesn't make you right. You have to actually be right, and for every Galileo that turned out to be right, persecute the church. So there's dozens and thousands of people like him. They were the next Galileo, but they weren't. They were just wrong, and that's it. Most of us, most of the time, are wrong, including scientists. Most scientists are just spitballing ideas. They're throwing hypotheses out on the wall to see what sticks. They're testing. This doesn't explain it. That's not it. Let's try this. That's how it works. And this perverse logic of how a scientific paper is written, which, when I say perverse, I mean it's really reverse logic. That is, after the fact, you go back and go, okay, here's what we just decided to do, step 1, step 2, step 3. But that isn't all what usually happens. It's usually much more chaotic and random of how sciences work. And so after the fact, you go, well, here's the logic we imposed on the chaos. But that's not what happens. And so the reason for all this is that most of us are wrong most of the time. And that's the whole point of democracy. It's this kind of, it's a never-ending, open-ended process of experimenting different ideas. We call them people in elections, but really they're just ideas. I like this guy because he has this tax plan or this gun control idea or this thing for climate change, whatever your thing is. And but there's no there to get to. It's a never-ending, open process that you have to keep experimenting, every year or 2 or 4 or whatever. And so that's why I think politics is science in a way, in experiments.
Yeah, when it comes to which ideas you feel see the light of day, like just taking your instance and specifically, why someone like, is it David Irving is his name? But anyway, the Holocaust deniers,
yeah.
versus, and why not spend time going through the arguments of the guy in his, the amateur theoretical physicist in his basement instead? Is it just that David Irving has the press around him already, and so it's worth doing in the public eye?
It's really to an extent people are interested in the subject, that there's some influence on politics or culture, education, or something. Like creationists, I don't really care what they believe, I guess, on one level, but they influence school boards to change the teaching of science in public schools. Okay, now you're now what you do does matter to me, and therefore we have to rebut it. Holocaust deniers were getting a lot of attention in the 90s around Schindler's List, or at least Schindler's List. And now, of course, the climate deniers are anti-vaxxers. Okay, here we go again. I just was writing a piece this morning on conspiracy theories surrounding COVID-19, and one is, of course, by the anti-vaxxers. This whole thing is a plot by the government and Bill Gates. Of course, Bill Gates is in on it to enforce the entire public like sheep to get vaccinated. Of course, they think this is a bad thing, and so it's just the topics change. There's always somebody else out there now. The flat earthers, we did nothing on them for the longest time. And then, what was it, maybe 2 years ago or so, all of a sudden they erupted into promise. Like, what? These guys, are you kidding me? Okay, so let's publish a big article and they can have, some e-skeptic pieces and get out there. Here's how we know the earth is round and moving. And, here are some really basic things. And the reason that is because most people can't articulate how it is we know the earth is round and how we know it rotates around the sun and not vice versa and so forth. There's lots of studies showing that most people are fairly ignorant of scientific ideas, even those who accept them. They go, yeah, I accept evolution. Okay, explain what it is. They can't. They sort of accept it on authority, although it's not purely an argument from authority. They just trust that scientists are checking other and doing their thing, and therefore I can kind of just do my thing and just hope that they're taking down the right path, something like that. And so we have to stay on top of that if they're having some kind of influence or change culture, education, politics, whatever.
You've you spent a lot of time debunking religious claims over the years. Haven't you noticed? And yeah. There needs to be a distinction clearly between scientific truth claims and religious dogmatic truth stories. You were just talking about creationism having an influence over schools and what's taught at schools. And so, it's interesting and necessary to parse what true is. What is, in your mind, the proper relationship between science and religion? And what's the best way to reconcile that need for science to win with that allowance of free religious thought?
Yeah, that's a hard one. The first lecture in Skepticism 101 for my Chapman students is "What is Truth Anyway?" That's the title of the lecture, and here I make a distinction between scientific truths and religious truths in this way. Let's say we want to know, did a man named Jesus exist? So most scholars, theists and atheists alike, think very probably someone named Jesus existed. Yeshua was a name. And, what was he crucified? Well, there's accounts that he was in the Romans. Heck, they crucified everybody. That was, big fun for them. Being common thieves and pockets and whatever. Failure to pay your taxes, so forth. They just crucified you. So that's not an extraordinary claim that one named Jesus existed and he was crucified. Now, the next step was he resurrected from the dead. Okay, that's an extraordinary claim. How extraordinary is it? Well, before the 7.5 billion of us alive today, 100 billion people lived before. And not one of them has come from the dead, except maybe one. So this would be a 100 billion to 1 extraordinary claim. That is really extraordinary. And the question is does the evidence for it warrant that kind of belief? Is the evidence 100 billion to 1 extraordinary? And the answer is no. It's not even ordinary. We have this. We have different accounts. They vary, not consistent, and and they were written decades after the fact, and so on. So there we can reject that idea, or that is to say, accept the null hypothesis that he was not resurrected from the dead, unless there's overwhelming evidence to lead us to change our mind on that one. But now, that said, if somebody who is a Christian says, look, I'm not claiming I can prove this. This is just part of my faith tradition. I accept it because I don't know. I just do. That it's how I was raised, or it's part of the dogma that we believe in, just like other people in other religions have their dogmas. I just mean it metaphorically true, like we all need to bear our own cross, bear our own burden. That is, life is hard and go from the suffering, and then you have redemption afterwards, and you start over. You're born again. I used to be an alcoholic. I'm no longer an alcoholic or drug addict or gambler addict or whatever, and you've been born. You've kind of bore that cross and moved past it, and now we have redemption, starting over. If that's what you mean, that's a different kind of truth. That's kind of a mythic truth or metaphorical truth or psychological truth. And so I have a chapter in the book on Jordan Peterson and his whole thing about that. Now, he goes further than I would on rather than just metaphorical truth. But if that's what he means, like, great literature has a message for us because it taps into deep-seated important issues in Jane Austen or Spear, Nietzsche or Dostoevsky or whoever. And Jordan loves all those great literary writers, and there's good reason why it's called great literature, because it's great. But to ask, well, but did Jane Austen write about real events, or the brothers Karamazov? Were there really a set of brothers named Karamazov? You're missing the point. That's not the point of the story. Like J.K. Rowling saying, by the way, the whole Harry Potter story, I didn't make it up. It's all true. What? You're off. You've lost your mind. It's like that's not the point, whether it's true. Of course it's not true.
I'm interrupting the show to issue a very important reminder that this show is brought to you by you. The show is fully funded by listener support. If you're a regular listener, we count that as a tremendous amount of support. And we are actually desperate to bring you value, and we're thankful that you tune in. Some of you have supported us by subscribing to the podcast on your podcast app or on YouTube, and rating and reviewing us, which really helps in terms of both our searchability and our general good rapport. Some of you have been making donations through our PayPal link, and we thank you so much. And some of you are sustaining members through Patreon. The truth is, I began this show as a hyper-intellectual, albeit immature guy who decided to begin cold calling world-renowned intellectuals from my bedroom closet. So the fact that this show exists at all and that people listen seems like a miracle. And the fact that so many of you regularly tune in or write in or donate is the most amazing thing in the world, and I'm so grateful for all of you. If you enjoy the show and you don't currently support and you'd like to, then please consider the list of ways to support that I just listed and choose an option that suits you. And to become a Patreon subscriber, go to patreon.com/thesocialexchange. A special thanks, as always, to our sustaining Patreon members, our patrons. First, to my family members who believe in what I do and who are also patrons, my parents, Linda and Tom, my sister Molly Rhodes, and my parents-in-law, Pete and Susan Matthew. Also, thanks to Susan Lennon, James Stacks, Chris L., Leah Naufahu, Sherry Chandler, Dee Dee Stout, Christopher Hanlon, Andre Pompel, Carter Vermont, Rick Barnett, Ann Earl, John Holt, Lila Ferguson, Inigo, Mary K. Villaverde, Michelle, Nancy, Sean, Regina Ferguson, Timmy Tucker, Christian, Kathleen Cochran, Diane, Trevor, Marjorie Israel, and Nuncio Paulo de Martino. To become a patron, which gets you exclusive content and a special shout out in each episode, visit patreon.com/thesocialexchange. That's patreon.com/thesocialexchange. And now back to today's interview with Dr. Michael Shermer. It's a strange thing to call that, though, the truth, isn't it? And so he's got this, that chapter describes very well his ideas about pragmatic truth versus scientific truth, and that it's meaningful and worthwhile to think of both of those things under that truth umbrella. That
Here it's, certain things like free will, determinism. Okay, so this is an old chestnut, and I don't think it's at all, even in principle, because of the limitations of language. What do you mean by free will? Obviously we live in a determined universe, but obviously I feel like I make free choices. It's a use fiction. I pretend it's true. You can't put it in technically, and in any case, we have to have it for it to have a civil society or so on. So you can be a determinist if you want. I'm going to believe compatible. I'm going to believe in some form of involvement, and I'm accountable. It works for me. That works for you. We all have our fictions in that sense. That I could see. It means certain things we can't determine, or maybe we just haven't yet. What was there before the Big Bang? Before time. There's certain things that we can't epistemologically conceive of. We just hit a wall, and what do you do with that? I don't know. I don't have to do anything with it. You just mean I'm just going to pretend, act, because I got to get up and out of bed and go to work. Okay, fine. So there we get in kind of murky ground that philosophers can go on and on about forever, and I just want to drop it. And I'm more pragmatic in that sense, I guess. And maybe God is in that question, also in that category of Mysterian mystery or consciousness, immaterial stuff like molecules in the synaptic gap between neurons. How does that give rise to thinking, to thought? feelings, to emotions, to the experience of life. No one knows. And it may just have to be given as a fact of nature, consciousness. It just is. It's unsatisfying to most. No one knows a better answer so far. And, there you could just say, look, this is what I think is true for me. I don't know what's really true. And we're just going to go on from there. Sometimes you just have to do that. It's unsatisfying as that sounds.
Yeah. Temperamentally speaking, I'm not inclined to agree with Peterson and his arguments there, but I see what you're saying. It's true that sometimes we need to propel ourselves forward, or aim up, as he would say, to make something of ourselves and to make our lives better. We need to do this even sometimes with limited information. So his argument, I guess, is we can call something a truth if it's a story that you can tell that'll move you forward in some meaningful way. So even if it's bullshit, it's true in the sense that it's helped you. Is it? Am I?
Yeah,
I don't know if I have my finger on exactly what he said. I'm probably doing a bad version of a steel man.
No. I think that's it. I mean, I'm not sure Jordan's even clear what Jordan believes. There is that aspect, and I don't just mean him. I mean that's true for all of us. I think. Another way to come at it is this: we get periodically we get articles submitted to Skeptic explaining some miracle through natural means, like that parting in the Red Sea was caused by earthquake, or that Jesus he wasn't really killed on the cross. He was put into a coma by his followers, ointment that caused him to slip into unconsciousness, and everybody thought he was dead. And then when he was in the tomb, they took him away, and they took him to France, and he married Mary Magdalene, and then all of a sudden you're in a Dan Brown novel. Okay. But Dan Brown's novel is a novel, but he based that on a nonfiction book, Holy Grail.
Right.
Those guys sued him actually for stealing their idea because they didn't mean it as a made up fun story. So, but to me, these are all interesting as it is to contemplate those. They may be missing the point. Perhaps there's nothing to explain. None of it actually happened. The writers just made it up to tell a story, to deliver some moral or something. And it didn't really happen. So we don't need science to step in and go, okay, here's the natural explanation for the apparently supernatural phenomenon. How did he turn how did he create loaves of bread and fish and all that? Maybe nothing happened. There isn't anything that even needs explaining. And so there's that.
Right. I have a question for you. I'm going to couch it in just an example. I just wrote a book called Outgrowing Addiction with Common Sense Instead of Disease Therapy. And in the book, I debunk the disease theory of addiction. So really just making a claim that there's no epidemiological space for this disease theory to occupy. And I learned along the way that people really rely on this disease theory of making meaning of this thing that's at once difficult to express and it's difficult to deal with on a personal level. So some of my most honest pushback is something like, listen, man, so what if addiction isn't a disease? Believing it is maybe a falsehood, but it's load-bearing. So if you tear into that, then my ideological wall caves in and there goes my life.
Right.
Personally, how do you suggest communicating truth claims in a way that people can just absorb those claims without feeling that maybe the world is crumbling underneath of them as a result?
Yeah, I guess it would depend on context. First, I'm glad you wrote the book. My father was an alcoholic, and I kind of see how that disease model comforts maybe the family. Like, oh, he's got a medical problem, so so that it's not like we did something wrong. He's morally weak or anything like that. It changes the way you think about it. And I'd rather think about it a different way. Like, this is a bad habit. Let's change that habit. And then we can all participate in something like I'm not sure where you go with that in your book, but.
Right. I guess what people are looking for is a way to grant their pain in sort of an information bundle or a soundbite without, I grant all the things that come packed along with the habit being confounding and very difficult and woven into the fabric of life, but you can say that it's not preordained and still believe those things. But anyway.
Yeah, a little bit like the whole victimhood stat. I write about this in the book in a chapter called What Went Wrong. This whole idea that everybody's a victim of something, and therefore, this justifies my suffering, but it also leads you to be inactive. Like, well, I guess I can't think about my life because I'm a victim. It's sort of embracing victimhood as a status, rather than what are you going to do about it? So in a way, you're granting undue power to whoever, whatever to you. So I will class out this with my students. They're 18 years old, right out of high school, and they have various assorted anxieties and depressions and whatnot that comes with leaving home, going to a new environment like college, and they have various experiences, and instead of like asking, did this thing really happen to you? I just assume whatever they think happened really happened to them, that they feel traumatized or that they're a victim of something. Okay, now what? Now what do you do? So
Right.
This guy did this thing too. You're still giving him the power over you. He still controls you. Do you really want to allow that? Because that's entirely up to you. Person is gone, and you usually like love breakups or something like this. Super traumatic, but for most of my students, but it's still the idea that let's assume it's all true. What are you going to do? Okay, so in a way, the addiction thing is like that. It's like, okay, whatever you want to call it, addiction, habit, it's a disease or it's a whatever. What are you going to do about it? That's the important thing, is how we act in the world, I think. So you get, I think that's what some of the pragmatists want to argue, that to what pragmatic is this idea? Setting aside for a moment the epistemological debate about whether it's true or not, just what do you think it does? So that's why I on religion a lot, because I mean, on the one hand, what do I care what somebody thinks in their head, as long as they don't harm anybody? And the answer is I don't. But but it's that harm principle that does count. There's enough religious people that do really goofy or dangerous things, enabled in part by the moderates who don't do crazy things, because they endorse the supernatural belief that is unfounded, and reason to believe in miracles or whatever your supernatural belief. So why even go that road in the first place? Even though most people don't go crazy and fly planes into buildings or blow up abortion clinics, most who are religious don't do anything like that. But it enables the ones that are more extreme to go even further.
Right. Good point. I'm wondering now how much or to what extent social media comes into play here. I mean, giving the devil his due seems to be a good answer to most problems, intellectually speaking. Any thoughts around reconciling free speech, cogent conversation with this whirlwind that is social media?
Yeah, social media. Well, I mean, it's a little bit like people when the printing press came online, and within a century or so, books were printed in mass, and everybody was reading, and the elites and intellectuals were hand wringing about this, because the masses are gonna want to get in on these conversations. This is crazy. We control this. And my friend Matt Ridley has a book out on innovation. He tells a story in this about the rise of coffee houses in the 18th century and early 19th century, in which this was, believe it or not, this was a big concern about, among government agents and autocrats, especially, because what are people doing in coffee houses? They're talking about the autocrats and all the power that they have, and we don't like that. Overthrow our oppressors and so on. It's not the coffee, it's what people are doing with it. That of course, when we look back on that, it's like the free press, great. Coffee houses, those are great. The internet, dangerous. Well, it's the same principle, And
Yeah.
Stories are told about when writing first came on, the oral people that were heavy into the oral tradition thought, oh, this is terrible. Memories are going to fail, and people are going to forget these wonderful stories, and they're going to be dependent on books. Oh no. So it's just every new technology has its threats. Now, of course, the First Amendment, this doesn't apply to Google and Facebook and one of those companies. First Amendment deals with the government, but But in a way, this whole business about, well, the Russians meddled in our election, therefore Facebook has to do something about it. Government should force them to, okay, this is a bad idea. The minute you set up some committee, even if it's all private, even if Facebook itself does it, the mission creep thing happens where you have people like Dennis Prager and Dave Rubin and Ben Shapiro, these people who are not extremists at all, get their videos demonetized or censored or because it said something that somebody in the bureaucracy there did like, or okay, so that's a problem. And I can see why they have to do it. I mean, Jack at Twitter feels he has to do something because of all the crazies that are on Twitter and like inciting hate and so on. But again, what is hate? And in the book I talk about in the 1850s, there were Southern politicians who argued that the speech of Northern abolitionists coming down to the South to give sermons and speeches and print articles and books about the horrors of slavery, that was hate speech. Now, they didn't use that word. That's a modern term. But they said it was an incitement to violence, that this could lead to slave revolts and that these ex-slaves are going to kill their masters. We can't have that. So that's that, speech is incitement to violence. It's a threat to the societal stability. We have to censor it. Same thing in the 1950s and 60s when Malcolm X and Martin Luther King in particular were, advocating for civil rights in these southern states. The reason they went there is because the problem was the most obvious, so they'd get the most press by marching there. And of course, that's what those politicians argued is, hey, this is dangerous speech. We can't have this. People are going to start rioting and burning down our cities and causing violence, so we have to censor it. And that's why we have to resist that.
People need to be allowed to use social media. Like it or not, it's ubiquitous. My curiosity is more around how let me, if I can, just one more quick story. I debated with Peter Hitchens one time. And if you can imagine this, I did. It was actually about addiction. But funny enough, he and I come to the same conclusion that addiction's not a disease. But it wasn't. We were debating, and get into that. But if you could believe it, it was more painful to listen to than Jordan and Sam's interview. I mean, the game, okay. The game that he and I were playing wasn't, let's see if we can learn something from this talk. It was, let's see if we can stomp on any chance that my interlocutor's point of view sees daylight. So Peter, for his part, is great at that game and definitely won. So I learned the hard way that there's this major difference between having a discussion because you need to be heard and having a discussion because you want to understand the truth. And any hope of me understanding his side of the truth, if there was any after the conversation, completely got squelched on social media. I was I'm a pretty young guy, but I was actually fairly new to social media at the time and getting, just completely berated with hundreds, thousands of nasty tweets, things like that. It just made me think, well, this is not an idea worth thinking about anymore. So I'm curious if I have my subset, 5,000 people listen to these episodes, maybe because you're Michael Shermer, there'll be, maybe it'll be tens of thousands. That's a small number compared to you going on Rogan the other day, and you have 2 million downloads on that show already. So I'm curious how you decide to prioritize what conversations you have on social media or not.
Yeah. First of all, when you say debate is a very different animal than conversations. I mean, the whole point of a debate is to win. So yeah. You kind of just pull out all the stop and do whatever you can to win. And I've done a lot of debates. I really think it's much more constructive to just have a so-called in conversation, so-and-so, and just talk. And sometimes it's even better to not have a moderator because the moderator feels the need to get in there and say something every once in a while, and it's usually not all that useful. But just talking, just try to clarify positions or find some common ground, I think is a completely different animal, and I think that's good. Social media, I don't know. It's very intractable as far as I know. I really don't have any idea what's the right way to use it. When I do something simple like post an article or something, I don't get much pushback from that? Obviously, sometimes none. But if I post anything about where I give my opinion about guns, for example, oh my God, you'd think I said I want to ban the Second Amendment, burn the Constitution, and
Right.
come to your house and take your gun. It's if I say something like, well, how about that, close the gun show loop? I mean, my latest one on this, conservatives ranting about we need to have ID check for voters. Of course, this is part of the voter suppression movement that the conservatives act on, in which they innocently say, well, don't you need an ID to buy a pack of cigarettes and a six-pack of beer, and you need one to get a driver's license on? What's wrong with doing it for voting? Well, they know perfectly well what they're doing. And if they were so concerned about IDs, how about a gun show purchases where people have fake IDs and so on, and they get their guns right there on the spot? Why aren't you so concerned that, oh, we can't do that because it's slippery slope and pretty soon the government's going to take all our guns away? So when I post something like that, it's holy shit, you should see the pushback I get on that. Like, okay, never mind. I'm not going to post about guns anymore. So I really have no idea what's the right thing to do. Some people use humor effectively, which I like. People like Steve Pinker, he pretty much just posts articles. Most of us like to read. And I try to just put it as another tool for knowledge consumption, because most of what I get on through social media is just stuff I want to read. At the point where sometimes I'll end up, 2 hours into my morning and I've got like 14 windows open and go, oh, I really should read this. Oh, I really got this. And it's like pretty soon I'm getting nothing done of my own worked out for the day yet. It's like, okay, I got to close the computer, off social media, and get back starting on my day. But it's a good problem to have. I mean, think about people centuries ago in comparison. They didn't even know how boring their lives were. But, if you transported, to life, then it would seem just in slow motion.
Did you have a favorite insight that you gained by going through the conversations you've had with people, the disagreements, pretty much steel manning people all the way through the book so that you could beef up your argument? Were there any insights there that you said, you know what, I really would not have come to this realization if I hadn't written the book in this way?
I think the chapter on Graham Hancock, after I did that show with him and on Joe Rogan's show, in which I was pretty much a debate, and I was there to show why I think he's wrong. And the chapter book on him, I still show why I think he's wrong. But that's not the point, is that, why don't we listen to outsiders more? Now, I mentioned, everybody and their brother has an alternative theory of physics. There's a lot of these in archaeology as well. Part of the problem people like Graham run into as an alternative archaeologist, so to speak, when he wants to the head of antiquities in Egypt, for example, knows, or maybe he's forgotten, that there's 100 people preceding him this shown who want to talk about their alternative theory of who built the pyramids or the Sphinx or whatever. So it's understandable why science grow impatient with that. That said, I think some people, I think that have a little more credibility, better arguments, better audience. Graham's a great writer. His books are really well written, and he reads them in that British accent. Sounds really good. And so I enjoy him, and his eyes they're not completely crazy. This is ancient alien. He's just arguing that there's this advanced this advanced civilization that lived maybe 20,000, 30,000 years ago, rather than maybe say 8 to 10,000 years ago with the rise of civilization. So, he's just in the date back. Okay, I think he's wrong, but not completely crazy. So, and he's always posting things on social media about stuff just keeps getting older. And of course, he has an agenda about that, but he's right. These do keep getting older. Like Göbekli Tepe, I knew nothing until I was preparing to engage with him on Joe Rogan's show. And it's like, what is this place? This is incredible. I mean, it's this temple, and it doesn't appear people live there, but there's these huge monuments, these gigantic, like 70-ton carvings, and these T-shaped structures by what, 100? I thought, hunter-gatherers, like couple dozen people, how they do this, because normally that takes thousands of people, hundreds or thousands of people. So they kind of overturn some older ideas we have about what hunter-gatherers are capable of doing. Now, I know for the bigotry of low expectations, say, well, couldn't have done it. There's been the aliens. but rather, I think, wow, hey, we need to revise our notions of what these people are like, and the whole timeline of civilization maybe has to be tweaked a little bit. That's okay. That's good. And had it not been for this guy, I wouldn't have even been thinking about that. So I think that's what I mean about heterodox thinking, people that think of the box. It doesn't mean they're right, but it often means maybe we should pay attention for all those other reasons we talked about for improving thinking and fine-tuning our theories.
So if you're a strong enough critical thinker, you will be able to parse out those things that Graham Hancock and et al. Offer that aren't necessarily in themselves linear good ideas or truth claims, but that you may not have understood or thought about had you not given them the time of day.
That's right. And also kind of linked to Jordan's stuff, some of Graham's things are kind of mythic, religious in nature, not necessarily true in the scientific sense, but kind of mythically true. That there's wisdom in the ancient peoples. They lived a long time ago, but a lot of social experiments. Maybe we should pay attention to the way people, in case we learn something from it. Something like that. Maybe there may be some value there. In other words, I'm just saying, it's okay to listen to outsiders. It's kind of what I do for a living. Is most of the people you deal with are outsiders or challengers to the status quo. That's okay. That's usually they're wrong, but usually scientists are wrong too. So that's okay.
Michael, I really enjoyed the discussion. I value the time you've given me today. Before we go, have I left anything out? Anything important from this discussion, or anything you'd like to add?
Well, thank you for your work, and thanks for having me on there. I'm glad you're pushing on that addiction thing. I think that needs a lot of work. But no, that's it. Skeptic.com is our webpage, or michaelshermer.com. Of course, my books are on Amazon, all that, the usual ways to find us. And let's keep the conversation going. That's all we have is our words to talk. So keep doing it.
Perfect. I'll link to all those in the show notes. Dr. Michael Shermer, again, grateful for the work you're doing. Especially grateful that you've given me some time to talk about your new book.